you. Thank you all for coming so much, and thank you, Anka, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. It was such a sort of serendipitous, hey, I'm on this email list, and oh, you're here. And you know, it's like beginning to develop the networks again that one needs when one is doing collaborative interdisciplinary work. I just arrived in the Upper Valley area in August. With my family, and so I'm sort of getting reacquainted with the East Coast, having done my graduate work at Brown. I'm certainly familiar, but this is really different from the Southwest, it turns out. Who knew? So part of what I'm going to do today is talk just a little bit about, it's like a tiny toe dip into my research agenda, situate the book in that, go into some a kind of formal paper-ish on the first part of the book, and then sort of let the formality dissolve a little bit in the second part of the conversation. And then we can talk about any of the things that are interesting. But I just want to give you kind of a roadmap of where we'll be going. Okay, so I think a lot about how and why we count people. It's been a long-standing interest of mine, counting both the dead and our living. And I think and teach a lot about how we use various media to datify bodies, and how that datification of bodies mediates our experiences of ourselves, but also others. And some of this is historical, right? So you have the image from the book there. The book spans roughly from the 1550s to the contemporary moment, because that's obviously what you do when you write your first book, is cover 300 and some years of history. And I'd be happy to talk about how this is not actually my dissertation work. We were talking about this a little bit in the beginning. If anyone is interested in, you know, why I sort of ditched that and moved on to something different. Other parts of my work are much more contemporary in their focus. There on the, I guess it's your right side, my left side, is just one example of some of the art installation collaborative work that I've been doing. This is called Wound Person, and below it is Anatomies for the 21st Century, and they are both sort of prototypes that a grad student named Nikki Stevens and I did while I was still at ASU, trying to think about how to make visible the black box technologies that many people are putting on their bodies in order to count activities or heartbeats or whatever, right? So thinking about that kind of quantification of human life. And if anyone is familiar with the history of science in the early modern period, Wound Person is inspired by Wound Man. Wound Man was a surgical text that was used by field surgeons who wouldn't have had the opportunity to anatomize bodies. And so Wound Man has all these amazing, like, stabbing wounds, anything that you would get in a battle sticking out of him everywhere. It's a very famous image. And we decided that we wanted to take that and think about like the bleeding out and the representational practices of a kind of visual of possible wounds, and use it to think about the data that's bleeding off of people at any given time. So Wound Person has a set of, I think it's almost 30, more than 30 different devices on their body. We are interested in gender expansive analysis, which is why it's a person and not Wound Man anymore. And you can see, this is a little bit of a close-up. This was all hand-drawn, right? But Wound Person has both sets of female and male reproductive organs, in part because there are so many devices that are centered around quantifying human sex or human reproductive experiences like menstruation or other kinds of things. So I'd be happy to talk more about that if you'd like, but these are, for me, I have a whole practice that is sort of thinking about how art practices can help us communicate both inside the academy and outside of the academy about some of these topics that seem quite esoteric or black boxed or too technical for people to sort of get their hands around. I also have, I'm going to keep doing that, aren't I? Touching the wrong keyboard. I have a kind of administrative life that I've had for nearly as long as I've held a faculty position, and that is sort of running DH efforts. So when I was in Claremont, I received a large Mellon grant to start the digital humanities at Claremont colleges, which was essentially a digital humanities studio. At ASU, I directed the Nexus Digital Research Co-op. And now those top two, the sort of top above the line is my current life. I'm still active in FemTechNet, can talk a little bit about that if people would like. I co-direct with Kathy Davidson of CUNY HASTAC, which is the Humanities, Arts, Science, Technology, Alliance, and Collaboratory. It's a mouthful, but it's a really great social network, essentially of people doing transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary work. It's a great venue for learning new skills and tools, and also for sharing your work out. So if anybody wants to talk about that, I'd be happy. And then this brand new thing, the Digital Humanities and Social Engagement Cluster at Dartmouth, for which I was hired as the inaugural chair and sort of like the anchor hire. There will be 2 new hires in the coming years, but this was something, there are 10 of these clusters that are, they were sort of launched and then fundraised for by the president, President Hanlon. And it's my job to give shape to the DHSE one. And I'd be happy to talk about sort of how we're imagining that at Dartmouth. But what I want to do now is move into Numbered Lives. So Numbered Lives is a media history of 2 particularly quotidian media, death counts and activity trackers. And both of these media determine who counts in what ways and why. To tell stories about quantum media, that is, media that count, quantify, or enumerate, is to tell stories not only about how we create knowledge, but also how we come into being with numerate media. A part of my goal in the book is to understand more about how particular bodies, gendered bodies, raced bodies in particular, do or do not become a part of our Anglo-American regimes of self-knowledge and control. I draw on the work of Sarah Kember and Johanna Zielinska for their thinking about media studies in terms of processes of mediation, right, rather than thinking about the objects necessarily, so not media as media, but mediation instead. In order to think about, as they say, our being in and becoming with the technological world. And that sort of process of constant becoming is really crucial for my thinking, and I'd be happy to talk about that more. Now, while Kember and Zielinska's theories are not intersectional per se, I bring their work into conversation with that of Black feminist scholars like Vivian May, Christina Sharp, and Patricia Hill Collins, who are drawing on, right, the history of work by the Combahee Collective, River Collective, and Kimberly Crenshaw, right, thinking about intersectionality. And part of the reason that I bring these scholars together in conversation is that I see Kember and Zielinska's work as a kind of sister theory that allows me to think about the matrices of power and racialized and gendered oppression as partially a result of mediation. Said another way, this group of scholars together enable me to think about quantum mediation of human life and death as a way of creating and sustaining ideas about race and gender. Now, because my research is interested in how these quantum mediations interface with the development of our political practices as well, I'm also thinking about how the history of quantum media is in part a history of bio and necropolitics. In a Foucauldian frame, biopolitics refers not simply to the politics of life, but to the change, a kind of historical shift from the interest in individual lives to concern for managing collectives, populations, and citizens. So in my work, I'm tracing the historical and formal relationships between things like account books, tables of numbers, watch-like pedometers, and digital media, and how states or nations use those media and mediations in order to know and control the lives and deaths of the people within their boundaries. Now, thinking about mediations enacted through our counting of the dead, I found myself struck by this installation by David Gurman. In 2009, Gurman installed the title here is The Nicholas Shadow, a large bell bearing the icon of St. Nicholas inside a former confessional chapel in St. Ignatius Church in San Francisco. Using data from the IraqBodyCount.org site, the bell robotically told the number of Iraqi civilian deaths that were reported each day. Bless you. The bell rang 906 times in 66 days. Described by Gurman as real-time memorials, Gurman's installations regularly use live streams of data to drive his multimedia installations. Excuse me. Now, the liveness of such installations is heavily mediated, and it provides us with an excellent example of the way in which data performs in a rather literal sense here in a multimedia installation. At the same time, the effective liveness in the Nicholas shadow is carefully produced through Gurman's willingness to play with sound, resonance, temporality, and setting in order to create new affective understandings of death and violence half a world away. Now, Iraq Body Count, IBC for short, which is Gurman's data source, and I'm quoting here from the IBC site, records the violent deaths that have resulted from the 2003 military intervention in Iraq. Its detailed public database includes civilian deaths caused by the US-led coalition and Iraqi government forces, and paramilitary or criminal attacks by others, end quote. As a database, IBC minimally collects the location, date, and number of civilians killed. When more information about identity, employment status, and other demographic categories is available, those are also recorded. When possible, the database also includes information about the circumstance and responsible parties for the death. The data is collected and reported by journalists, NGO and hospital staff, and other citizen witnesses, right? So this is an effort that exists outside of state and official efforts, right? The data is collected, in addition to the official IBC database, there is a page called Recent Events that records reports from casualties from witnesses and emergency response staff, usually within 48 hours of the event. These particular recent events are not considered official, but rather provisional counts by the IBC. Now, Gurman, when he was creating this, drew his live stream for the Nicholas Shadow from the recent events page, which was scraped hourly for updates. Now, the IBC database only records documented casualties that have been publicly released, thus making this database a tertiary resource more like an encyclopedia than a first-person account, despite that kind of like recent event, first-person witness effect that it has. The project, quote, collects, archives, analyzes, and systematically extracts details from every available distinct report for all identified incidents and individuals killed, end quote. And it has at minimum 2 sources for every casualty that is reported. Consequently, there is a variable but always present time lag between the casualty event and its appearance in the IBC database. The IBC site notes this as well, quote, there is a considerable gap between the initial reporting of events, right, so that sort of recent events page, and their first appearance in the IBC database. And at present, that's about 5 months. So the sense that the IBC provides real-time access, which is being leveraged by Gurman, is actually a kind of artful fiction, right, that is deployed both by the site itself and embedded in Gurman's installation. By drawing on the recent event counts rather than the verified database, Gurman's installation draws from the most timely, if unverified data, even as it draws some authority from that other verified data set, right? So it's taking some of the authority from its careful verification, but that data that he's actually streaming is not that verified data set. As a consequence, understanding the temporality of the installation is complicated. Nicholas Shadow transforms experiences of both space and time between the event and a viewer's experience of it. According to Gurman, and I'm quoting him here, the notion is to collapse spaces, create a portal between the site of installation and the site of conflict, so that we can understand on some level what's happening in a place and meditate on it, feel a deeper sense of connection, and simultaneously a sense of disconnection or distance from that zone. So Gurman is very explicit in his effort to sort of collapse time and space while also recognizing that the distance is an important part of the affect, or the affective power. So this compression of time and space is supported by the design of the installation, which keeps the numbers on the site driving the installation hidden. So it might be a little challenging to see, but when someone walks into this kind of central room, which is a curved space inside the church, they encounter the bell on a screen, right? It's backlit, it's got the reflection, they'll hear the sound, but the screen effectively screens out the computing equipment, right, that is driving the data. And also by not signaling at the sort of site of the installation the difference between recent events and the verified data, there's a kind of screening going on there as well. By doing this, Gurman is creating a program where visitors are positioned as real-time witnesses, experiencing each death as an event rather than a textual report. Without access to the data stream itself, viewers must sit with the large ringing bell and its resonant echoes, waiting to see when the ringing ends. Consequently, the death counts register for visitors not as numbers visually consumed, but as a durational experience. Now, the more than 100,000 civilian casualties in Iraq ought to be shattering, whether communicated by a tolling bell or by reading a spreadsheet. But Gurman's installation attests to the power of embodied experiences of death counts, the power of those death counts to disrupt the normal flow of life for those who are otherwise sheltered from that particular violence. It also exemplifies, and this is a thing that I'm very interested in, the power of sonic and tactile experiences to create an impression that lingers longer than the all too familiar tabular display of numbers. Now, Gurman was sensitive to the fact that the bell that he's using is roughly the size of a human torso, and to the ways in which the confessional space created a resonant chamber that would amplify the ringing of the bell and its vibrations both in space and in the human body of viewers. He created a device that would take civilian casualty numbers and transform them into a sound that reverberates through the hollow of a bell and that of the body. It's literally breathtaking. But how is it, and this is sort of my motivating question, how is it that we have arrived at a place where numbers arranged in a table, those elegant compressions of messy realities, don't have the same capability to capture our attention and steal our breath? What does the affective power of an installation like the Nicholas Shadow suggest for our understanding of the bureaucratic media we use to count the dead and the kinds of being that they encourage? Counting the dead has long been a crucial activity for the living. As Thomas LaCour suggests, dead make social worlds. And humans have long made lists of the dead as ways to, quote, and I'm quoting LaCour here, constitute communities that live from generation to generation, end quote. As publications or public monuments, the technology used to display death counts have remained remarkably stable over time. Tabular displays, like those that are produced by parish clerks, and I'll talk more in detail about this, but these are two examples. One is from a collected book, and the other is from a broadsheet that would have appeared sort of posted on a wall or, a public venue. Tabular displays like those produced by parish clerks or a running mortality count like the IBC remain the media of choice for counting our dead. The tracking and enumerating of death has a long history with roots that are deep in Anglo-American religious and civic practices, which make it clear that death counts are anything but neutral registers. Rather, they exist in complicated technosocial assemblages that permit certain kinds of being and becoming for both the living and the dead. Now, if counting the dead is a way of forming social and historical communities, then I think we need to understand the impact that our media forms have on shaping these communities. If the counting of bodies is intimately wrapped up in the Anglo-American desire to witness and commemorate loss, but what is the nature of losses represented in the media of death counts? Do our tables or lists of dead express the tragedy of a death come too soon or too violently? This is certainly how memorials seem to work, but what of the more bureaucratic media like a database, an inventory, or a parish register? Now, looking at the long history of our body count media demonstrates that practices transformed with the shift from church registers to bills of mortality. Subsequently, and I'm going to go back and forth just a little bit here, what you see here are like church registers, right, written by hand. These are 19th century forms that searcher women, that I'm going to talk about in a minute, would have used, right? But part of what I'm asking you to sort of collect in your brain is this historical shift from hand collecting accounts of dead into something much more sort of bureaucratic and published and formalized like this. Okay. Bills of mortality, along with other media like inventory logbooks, were the models for 18th and 19th century innovations that made the counting of bodies commercial and epidemiological rather than commemorative. Indeed, it is my argument that the transactional forms that we use for counting human bodies, whether alive or dead, are at the heart of the modern reality that tables of numbers are relatively poor vectors for the emotional and social impact of human mortality. In order to understand the power of Gurman's intervention, I think, we need to understand how media technologies like tabular forms and databases effectively separated reading publics from the space, time, and feelings of human life. Further, we have to understand how the interests of the nation state, the colonialist, and the slave owner are all written into the forms that we use to count bodies. Understanding this media history makes it possible to understand why these same forms and their lineages of power, control, and national interest are sites for intervention, are sites of intervention for people of color in the United States and civilians around the world who are literally dying to be counted. Now, while people have long counted their dead, tables enumerating deaths have their origin in these early modern mortality bills, which are the first body counting technologies to leverage a media that was initially designed for merchants, right? So the argument here is that tables were initially, and this goes to Mary Poovey's work, right, were initially about account books, right, and the presentation and the production of authority and trustworthiness for merchants, and then they get imported into this space of thinking about human death. Printed from the beginning of the 17th century through the mid-19th century, what are known as bills of mortality were designed to keep the British government apprised of mortality rates. These publications were also made available to the public as handbills, right? So they're just a single sheet of paper that could be bought on subscription or individually. As such, they were both corporate documents and among the earliest periodicals that gave us our modern news media. Now, while many early modern and medieval cities had burial registers, and the practice of naming the dead on monuments or epic poetry extends well back into Greek antiquity, counting the dead has long been a Western practice, the British mortality bills were particularly innovative and commercial. Just in case those of you here are not experts on early modern London, prior to the 19th century, London was divided by what are now known as ecclesiastical parishes, administrative units that were governed locally by church officials and that would report to the Lord Mayor of London and ultimately the King or Queen. The English parish clerks had been long tasked with tracking people. In fact, the first charter that they received was granted in 1442, so they had been doing this work for a very long time. The 15th century charter that came from Henry VI, the company formally assumed responsibility for the bead or prayer rolls of the Fraternity of St. Nicholas. Now, in Catholic tradition, bead rolls list the names of those who should receive prayers during intercessions and Mass, and they record the dates on which prayers for the departed should be offered. Now, while England had transformed the religious infrastructure to better serve a Protestant nation and no longer supported Catholic indulgences, it was likely this kind of tracking, a kind of religious tracking of the dead, that positioned the parish clerks for a successful bid to the sole right to publish and earn income from the mortality bills. The bead rolls did not simply record the dead, they also ordered the activities of the living by marking dates and persons for intercession. They were a kind of program or set of directions for being, right? Thinking again of Kember and Zielinska's sense of becoming with our media, that was activated in regular Catholic devotional practice. And we might think of this as a kind of religious algorithm in contemporary terms. Post-Reformation bills of mortality, like these, were not a part of liturgical practice. Nevertheless, they similarly programmed the daily activities of those who wanted to avoid the plague-stricken parishes, functioning as a kind of civic algorithm. Further, they made particular categories of death visible to the British government, thereby mediating how the Crown understood its subjects and their dying. Now, mortality bills have a clear set of formal rules and a very particular spatial logic. They're deceptively simple, I mean, almost to the point of being boring, which encourages the assumption that they are transparent vehicles of meaning. The bills announce their counts as complete and timely surveys of the deaths in the city, right? So they're announced simply as the deaths and casualties this week. There's no sense that it might be incomplete or varied or anything like that. Because of the administrative structure in place, it is more accurate to say that what they count are the burials performed within Anglican parishes, right? There's a big gap between the deaths this week in all of London and the burials performed in Anglican parishes. This limitation is entirely elided in the interface. The causes of death are listed to the left in alphabetical order, and the number who have succumbed to that particular cause appear on the right, with each value aligned on a printer's rule for uniformity. The top half of the page always contains the list of mortalities by cause, followed in the last third of the page by an aggregate count of those individuals who were christened and buried. During the plague years, when the mortality bills were an especially popular form of public news, the counts also included a separate section with the number of deaths due to plague, and often a measure of the increase or decrease in burials that week, and sometimes with the parish information as well. Now, while the parish clerk's charter evinces an anxiety about accurate recording, it is also very clear that only certain kinds of people were to be included in mortality counts. In particular, the Crown wanted information on its adult, white, Anglican male subjects. The bills, quote, were to set down the name and surnames of all such freemen as shall be buried in their several parishes, and of what company everyone so buried was free, end quote. From the medieval period onward, an English freeman denoted the freedom to earn money, trade, and own land, as opposed to those who were the property of a feudal lord, for example. Prior to the 19th century, all freemen were members of the livery company. They were all over 21, and they had either served a 7-year apprenticeship or were freemen by patrimony. Only legitimate children were eligible, or partition, which required a fee. One had to be a British citizen to be a freeman, meaning that anyone in the city, and there were many, from England's many trade partners would not have been eligible. Jewish and other non-Christian subjects were not formally permitted to become freemen prior to 1830, although there are just a handful of instances of Jewish freemen in the records. These restrictions alone would have made it very difficult for non-white Londoners to join the community of freemen during the period when the mortality bills first became popular. While race is a historically contingent category, not active in our modern sense in early modern England, we do have clear evidence that non-white people, including those born in Europe and Africa, were working in London in both enslaved and free contexts from at least the 16th century onward, right? So there's a significant population that is being missed by these counts. That's sort of like the core point here. It says that it's a capture of all of the deaths in London that week, but it's really a very small subset. Prior to 1923, not that long ago, women of all races were not eligible to become freemen, but could inherit their husband's privileges at death. They would lose those privileges if they remarried. Now, while the bills did gather information on women who, for example, quote, did away with themselves, usually by hanging, or those who died in childbirth, the royal motivation for the mortality bills was to capture the deaths of adult white Anglican men who were considered important factors in the growing economic engine of the British Empire. At the same time, the bills themselves were an economic engine for the parish clerks and inaugurated the large-scale public consumption of news about death and dying that has been central to periodic media ever since. While women were not, and still are not, formally allowed to serve as parish clerks, women's work was central to the production of the bills. Parishes employed poor London, and I'm quoting here, women to serve as nurses to care for the sick and paid female searchers to examine diseased bodies. And again, those small sheets of paper are how the female searchers would have submitted their counts to the parish clerks, who then would have put it in a published bill form and made the money off of it. Those who refused to care for the sick were often assigned to the more gruesome work of the searchers, who were responsible for inspecting those who had fallen ill to determine if plague was the cause and to certify cause of death for corpses, right? So if they just came across a corpus, it was their job to certify the cause of death. Engaged in official government business, these female searchers were required to take an oath before the London mayor and were paid per body examined. According to the historian of science, Deborah Harkness, a woman could earn as much as 17 shilling 4 a year for the inspection of dead bodies, in addition to their alms allotment as members of the parish poor. Now that 17 shilling would have been roughly half a year's cash wage for a well-paid female domestic servant at the time, right? So this was a relatively good, if incredibly dangerous, way to make a living for a woman in England. Like the spatial ordering of the double entry book, detailed by Mary Poovey, the form of, and I'm curious, there it is, okay. The form of the mortality bill stabilized access to information and proclaimed, quote, the rectitude of a company whose individuals included a variety of social ranks, right? So there's a way in which the bill, as opposed to these handwritten notes, certifies both the veracity of the count and also the authority of the parish clerks themselves. By printing the same orderly, formal account each week, the parish clerks were able to erase any mark of uncertainty or error in the counting of the dead. If double-entry books, as Poovey suggests, produced an idealized world, one in which risk and human labor have disappeared from view, the bills produced an ironically idealized world in which the reporting of epidemic disease and mass death appeared as clean and orderly as an account book. Further, while women's work was everywhere embedded in the making of the bills, the formal structure of those bills effaced those labors. As a new use for the enormously popular broadside, the bills illustrate a way in which public accounts and their transformation into a codified system of public accountability tended to privilege not just rule-governed writing, but also the system of education and credentialing by which individuals, almost always white Anglican men, were rendered obedient to such rules. As a public forum, they argued to readers that a rule-based medium produced a factual account of a chaotic social experience. What's more, the repeated completion of each week's tally with the requisite predefined categories effectively hid all that was left out of this particular public account, including youth, non-Christians, dissenters from the Church of England, and people of color who also died during the massive plague outbreaks that rocked 17th century England. In addition to mediating readers' experience of the plague, the bills mediated both the engagements of clerks and searchers with the dead and dying. People were quickly placed into categories and their dead and dying bodies enumerated, and then they were simply left for burial by others. Now, these were available as broadsides from the parish clerk's own printing press, which was instrumental in creating a new media ecology in which the weekly news drove epistolary exchange and prompted conversations with neighbors and friends throughout London. So you have the experience of the epidemic has this kind of salutary effect of circulating the news in a way that hadn't been done before. Samuel Pepys famously recounted many of his conversations, such as the one from May 24th, 1665, quote, where all the news at the local coffee house is of the plague growing upon us in this town, end quote. As Will Slaughter suggests, the weekly death count led to a periodic rather than cumulative understanding of the epidemic. This periodicity was intimately wrapped up in the daily lives of readers and was further enhanced by a somewhat incongruous inclusion in each bill of the cost of bread as it was set by the mayor of London and the aldermen. So with the publication of the bills then, death counts came as regularly as bread prices, and both were mediated by an inexpensive textual interface that drew on the rigors of accounting forms. The form, along with periodic repetition, worked to produce everyday experiences of life and death in London as rule-bound, spatial, and clearly defined. One could plan shopping routes based on the Paris infection rates, with the very same interface that allowed the budgeting for basic food needs. While Londoners' sense of security may have broken down as the death counts grew, the function of the bill as a mediator of experience remained. As the news continued to argue for an increased rate of infection, London's elites fled the city for the countryside, and they often remained there until news reported the abatement in new affections. The handbills, I argue, were a particularly generative media form, creating possibilities for both the state and its subjects to understand their city in terms of a geography of death, right? And I think one of the things that's really interesting about these forms is they look very banal, but I think once they begin to emerge as something that gives you a map of death in your everyday life, it seems much stronger to me. They were also vectors through which, as Foucault's work on biopolitics suggests, the sovereign could manifest state power in the ability to know, count, and publish human death. It gave each reader insight into the categories of death that were available, and I think more importantly, those that mattered to the official apparatus of the British Crown. So that's a sort of deep dive into one section of the first half of the book, which deals with death counts. There's quite a lot more that comes, but I wanted to give you a kind of sense of how I'm doing a formal reading of the media types in order to think about how they were mediating experience. What I'm going to do now is jump to the quantification of human life, which forms the second half of the book. The book has a kind of theoretical introduction and then two chapter sections, right? And then they are sort of wrapped up together at the end. But they pair biopolitics and necropolitics, and I think those two phenomena need each other in order to make sense in our sort of understanding of modern life. Okay, so in addition to being interested in how we count the dead, I'm interested in remediations that take place to render human activity as something that can be gathered and represented to presumably interested audiences. In the second section of the book, I ask, in what ways can a history of activity tracking media help us make sense of the entanglements between individual bodies, quantum media, and superstructures like the nation state or corporation? Are there connections between modern quantified self and other instances of quantified human techno-becoming to which we should attend? Are there deep histories that should shape how we understand the lifestyles and art that are being offered today as part of quantified culture? Now, quantifying human life takes as many, if not more, forms as the quantification of human death. It also has an equally long history. Tracking life, steps, heartbeats, fluid pressures, habits, has long been a part of Anglo-American cultures. So long, in fact, that there's a kind of collective amnesia about it. Histories of the quantified self movement tend to start in the middle of the 20th century. Gina Neff and Don Nafis go back further than most, suggesting, for example, Ben Franklin's tracking as an early example. In the second half of Numbered Lives, I draw our attention to the historical fact that tracking and the belief that numbers will somehow save us from the messy, memory-taxing work of understanding ourselves stretches back at least to the early modern period, right? So I didn't know this when I began the research, but there's a kind of shared historical moment of origin, right, in the 1500s, when you get both the early plague bills or mortality bills and then also the first activity trackers. In addition to extending in time, the forms that are familiar to us in modern self-quantification are also not new. They include, and I'm not going to talk about this one, but I'd be happy to in Q&A, textual life writing, and then also the use of mechanical devices to track distances and activity. So how many of you sort of feel yourself a part of the quantified self movement or know about it? Do you wear a step counter? Anybody? Oh, all right. A couple people, yeah. Normally it's like half the room is like, yes, step counters. But the quantified self movement has been around named as such since 2009. Imagined as both aspirational and grassroots, it has this origin story that was authored by Gary Wolfe and Kevin Kelly. And they describe it this way. Quantified self is a collaboration of users and tool makers who share an interest in gaining self-knowledge through self-tracking. In a 2009 piece for Wired magazine, Wolfe narrates the start of the QS movement as a kind of grassroots effort. And this is sort of his narration. He and Kelly are sitting around, they're out in Silicon Valley one day, and they, quote, noticed that many of our acquaintances were finding clever ways to extract streams of numbers from ordinary human activities. How clever, right? Like the 17th century clerks who kept baptism rolls or the civic clerks who compiled the mortality bills, Wolfe and Kelly see people transforming human activities into streams of numbers. While early modern mortality bills involved an outside set of agents, that is, like the counting women, the clerks, the clergy, the QS movement is almost always founded in its sort of 21st century iterations on self or automated tracking. And there's a way in which both of these efforts, right, by outside agents and by the self, are efforts to define human activities by what is or can be counted. Their Quantified Self website was launched in 2007, and it operates as a social hub and information portal for the larger community. It also serves as the digital face of the company, advertising the hope of, quote, self-knowledge through numbers and celebrating a, quote, new culture of personal data. Wolf and Kelly engage in a familiar rhetoric of ownership and agency. People gather, read, and share their own data. It's personal, and they don't necessarily make anything but the personal visible. In many cases, it's also quite public and highly commodified. So Wolf and Kelly describe QS as a bottom-up numerical method of understanding ourselves. And as we've seen, 17th century lives and deaths were rendered meaningful to the English crown by, and I didn't get into John Grant and his life tables, but they were a further compression of the mortality bills, right? So we went from handwritten notes into the mortality bills and then into these large life tables that are the basis of demography and statistical science today. So Grant's life tables rendered lives and deaths meaningful to the English crown only insofar as they contributed to aggregated data and the knowledge that it produced about vital statistics and population change. And that's really that shift to biopolitics right there. Individual particularities were not just erased or left out of the tables, which is problem enough for a historian. They were rendered meaningless to the state in their own moment. Moreover, these figures were then turned into the actuarial tables that are used to monetize the risk of death for the life insurance industry. Local death records became official state knowledge of life activities that was then leveraged to create profitable new industries. And while different in many respects, corporate harvesting of biometrics share a certain structure with the mortality tables. In fitness trackers, with fitness trackers, wearers' activities are reimagined as value-added processes, which include sports metrics, life logging, things that are central to the QS movement. In these kinds of frames, and this is a screenshot from the Jawbone Up company and their suite of devices that they have right now. Let's see. Purchase and use of a smart wearable product automates the translation of human activity into data streams that, like demographic data, are considered meaningful only once aggregated, visualized, and analyzed. And interestingly, if you try to download your own quote unquote raw data from most tracking devices, it's scrambled, it's hashed. With a proprietary algorithm, you can't make sense of it. So you don't have access to the unmediated data, whatever that would mean. Quantified self, when accomplished this way, seeks to empower users/wearers by transforming life activities, running, sleeping, eating, walking, breathing, the involuntary contractions of smooth muscles like the heart, into the locus of marketing, market analysis, consumption, and production all at once. Now this is all sort of framed with know thyself, right? A kind of rhetoric that is old and has been around for a very long time. According to the classical Greek author Parnasius, I've got that name wrong, Pausanias, know thyself and nothing in excess were maxims brought to Delphi by the 7 sages. Though enduring, this push towards self-knowledge and self-management has undergone significant change since the Temple of Delphi, including shifts towards ever greater quantification. Though certain kinds of moral and ethical motivation drives every use of the Delphic aphorism, they were originally thought to be maxims that were useful to men. Those, when we see this sort of know thyself rhetoric at work today, they're deeply imbricated in the more modern logics of Western capitalism and patriarchy. 21st century exhortations to know thyself perform mediations that are still about making an individual legible to a polity or community. But instead of monumental inscriptions, the media are now clip-on discs, smart jewelry and watches, and the apps and mobile devices with which they communicate. The media by which we are meant to know ourselves are now attached to individual bodies, creating a pervasive and perpetual mediation not seen before. Rather than something like Apollo governing the good life, we have corporations exhorting us to find ourselves in the data that we freely give to them. This shift from the inscribed temple to the wristband was neither sudden nor necessary. Instead, it involved several other media transformations that included tools that look more like wheelbarrows, personal notebooks, and pocket watches. And as I mentioned in my book, the first thing I do is talk about journaling and textual life writing. But then I move from the text into thinking about the machinic. And this is where I'm going to sort of go off script and just talk with you about a few devices. And sort of the broad arc of the argument of the second half of the book. So this is Da Vinci's first drawing of a Waywiser. This is a 17th century German pedometer, and this was actually Leibniz's pedometer, which is designed to look like a book, but is actually a pedometer. It's held in a Leibniz museum now. And part of what I want to draw our attention to, right, is that these were incredibly ornate, beautiful devices, right? So this like conspicuous consumption culture that we think of today with like the iWatch or something like that has been around since at least the 17th century, right? And something like this, it's quite heavy. They're large like this. It sat in a box, and it would have been either carried by a person, and it would have been attached. I don't know if you can see it very well here in this image, but there's a tiny little ring right here. And that would have attached a chain or a ribbon to the hip, the knee, and the ankle of the wearer. So it was a very mechanical advancement of the pedometer itself, right? It was also an instance where you're drawing on watchmaking practices, right? And using the same expertise that watchmakers have in order to make pedometers. Now, interestingly, I think for the arguments of the book and its sort of interest in what the state and nation are doing vis-a-vis quantification of human life, these people didn't care about steps. It was literally a new way of measuring land, right? So this is also the historical moment when enclosure happens, when people begin to cordon off spaces so that other people can't hunt or be on their land. And they had been laying chain, right? A very arduous practice. All of a sudden now they could say, walk your land and we'll tell you how much it is, right? So it automates the counting that would have been done by laying of chain. And some of these devices are outfitted to go on wagons or carriages. They even have ones that go on horse saddles, right? And it would have then been attached to the horse's hip, knee, and ankle, right? So it's a way of automating distance and measuring land, and it becomes an incredibly important tool both for the British Empire at home, but also abroad. So it's a very colonialist technology. It's not until we get to Napoleon that it even becomes about health. So this is an image of Napoleon's pedometer watch, which is held by the Numismatic Society of Philadelphia. And Napoleon's doctor was mad that he didn't go out and do his steps, right? He wasn't getting enough activity. But he also knew that Napoleon wasn't going to truck with being surveilled. So he told him, hey, this is a self-winding pocket watch. And the self-winding mechanism thing is true, but it's also a step counter, right? So it suddenly put surveillance of Napoleon in the same space with Napoleon just keeping track of time, right? And this is really the moment when we begin to get a shift into thinking about the pedometer as a medical or health tool as opposed to one about just surveying land. And the two things run side by side for a long time. This is one that was made by Payne & Company. I just want to give you a sense of how much it looks like a watch, right? It looks like a watch to such a degree that people were able to surreptitiously put it in other people's pockets as a way of surveilling their activity, right? So surveillance, even when it's not digital, has always been a part of this history. There are these amazing stories of military officers putting it in night watchmen's pockets, of factory owners putting it in a night watchman's pocket, of a father putting it in his supposedly consumptive daughter's dress before she goes to a ball. She comes home, she says, oh, Papa, I'm too tired to do dishes. And he says, oh, interesting, you just danced 13 miles last night. Get up and go wash the dishes, right? So this surveillance thing has always been there. A lot of this is happening in Europe and the UK. So those early pedometers that I showed you right there, right? These are mostly made in the then Holy Roman Empire, where they had a lot of really amazing technicians who were making scientific devices. You begin to get them in the UK and other parts of Europe, and then finally they come to the US. And when they come to the US, there's a kind of innovation. This is the patent for it, a kind of innovation where you get additional whorls around here, so it looks a little bit less like a clock, and what that allows one to do is measure more than 12 miles. So you use the whorls as a kind of multiplier. But one of the things that I think is so interesting is that they were first sold by Tiffany and Company. Right? And so these were high-end devices. You could get them with a brass face or with a mother of pearl face. They would be of different expense levels depending on what they were made out of. But in today's dollars, they were somewhere between $100 and $500 each, right? So you're talking about the late 19th century, people are buying incredibly expensive devices. And at this point, they're all about step tracking and health monitoring. The history of the sort of step tracking and health monitoring is largely, in the US, is largely a white male one up until about the early 1910s, teens, when all of a sudden you get this craze where debutantes are wearing pedometers during the ball circuit, right? So they've got their season of balls, they're competing with one another along on their dance cards. They're writing not just the names of the partners that they danced with, but the miles danced, right? And you begin to see political cartoons like these, right? Where you've got this woman, she's got a pedometer right here on her leg. And part of what this is mocking, it says, "What a spectacle, the debutante anxiously consulting her pedometer after each dance, her faithful but weary escort mopping his brow." And so you get, it takes like not even 20 years for the pedometer to hit the American ball scene. It's imported over from France. And then within 20 years, you get people complaining that the women are being too athletic. They're wearing out their partners. They're not participating in the courtship rituals that they're supposed to be participating in. And so there's this really interesting thing that happens when pedometers and step tracking becomes a feminized thing. It also becomes deeply problematic. Whereas for men, right, it's like, still go out and hunt things and be fit. It's great, right? And so you get this gendering of interpretation that happens quite quickly. As a just kind of last example, I want to draw your attention to early behavioral electronics, right? So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that the fitness tracking and the land tracking that is happening with pedometers in the US is mostly available to the white population. You then get, I talk in the book about a very different kind of accounting that happens around enslaved bodies and the lives and the way those lives are counted with different media technology. But when you get Gable and Gable's behavioral electronics, you begin to get the ankle monitor. This is the very first instance of the ankle monitor. And these are some of the historical images that Gable and Gable wanted to have up when thinking about sort of juvenile offenders and integrating them back into sociality. Part of the reason that I want to think about this is that Gary Wolfe, right, who writes about the quantified self movement, also does a write-up of Gable and Gable. They have a really interesting story, and never connects the activity tracking for health that happens in largely elite white male culture with the sort of carceral monitoring that's going on in other spaces, right? And despite this historical picture, we know that carceral monitoring is a highly racialized practice, right? And it's one that has particular valences in both Black and Hispanic communities. And so there's a way in which what people talk about when they talk about quantified self today is only this sort of white, relatively affluent health or fitness, wellness, know thyself discourse. But there's a shared history, technologically and ideologically, with something like carceral tracking, but that has been racialized in very particular ways. So I'm going to stop there and take questions. And thank you so much for your work of signing for the talk. That's not an easy talk to sign. Yeah.
Okay, so I know that you're looking at death counts and mortality statistics.
That's right.
Are you also looking at birth counts? And because I see a lot of similarity between the recording of deaths and the recording of new lives.
Yep.
And just as one example, I know you showed the Nicholas Shannon installation. A lot of hospitals actually have
bells.
Yeah,
yep.
bells that
yep.
get rung when new babies are born, or songs that get played throughout the hospital every time a baby is born to disrupt the routine. And I was wondering if you go into comparison here also.
So I don't at all, but it's an obvious space for more work, right? And you know, one of the things that was so hard about writing this book was that because it has such a broad historical span, it couldn't have a certain kind of depth in any individual historical moment, right? So there are really interesting examples of the sort of birth rate craze that happens in France, right, in the 18th century, where everyone's freaking out because the birth rate has fallen and what are they going to do, where that intersects with the history of midwifery and obstetric medicine, all the way into contemporary stuff, right? I do talk about censuses because in the US, mortality counting happens along with the census in a way that's different from in the UK, but I don't talk about live birth in the censuses. It's a space that has obvious opportunity for more work, but I don't do it. Yeah?
Just a clarification question. Those early pedometers, the super early stuff, when did that start happening?
So this is a 16th century pedometer. This is a 17th century pedometer. This is Da Vinci's drawing. So the early Waywisers, the first Waywiser that I know of is 1525.
A follow-up question. Why was that a thing, 1525?
For land mapping.
Oh, so it started as land mapping.
That's right.
Oh.
That's right. Yeah, so the history that I tell, and I didn't know that this was going to happen, right? But the history that I tell is that and partly it's because they call them Waywisers instead of pedometers, but they begin specifically for the purposes of land mapping. And it's not until the Napoleonic moment that we get that convergence with health. And so it's all land mapping. All of these were not about human steps as an indicator of health. They were about mapping the distance that someone walked for other purposes.
Is it accurate?
Well, yeah.
So this is awesome, right? Because no, but also modern stuff isn't accurate either, right? I did a really interesting sort of self-study with two different jawbone devices, those ones that I showed you a little bit earlier. And right on the same body, doing the same walking, I gendered them differently, different step counts, right? So for as long as people have been counting steps, they're also worried about the accuracy of the step counting. And there's lots of discussion about how to calibrate your pedometer, right? So initially they start out as this very mechanical connection, right, with the string or the rope to the actual device. Eventually with the American pedometer, you get a weighted device so that it's the footfall, right, that is doing it. But then there are these studies, right, in early America, like, the pedometer is fantastic, it's going to tell us all this stuff. We gave it to nurses and it didn't work. And what they blame that on is nurses' soft steps, right? The nurses walk too gently and so therefore can't be counted. And there's a whole section in my book on the move of the pedometer into home economic theory and the idea of homemaking and how that happens. But it's they have never been accurate. They're still not accurate, and yet, right, they have been used for a very long time. Yeah?
So it comes accurateness. I'm kind of curious about those numbers appear in your presentation, like a accountability of the data, because it's been a very long time ago, and
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what is it that?
The accurateness of the numbers.
Oh, yeah.
For the accountability of the data. So I'm kind of curious about how accurate are those numbers, and which category do you think is the most noisy ones, and which one is the most accurate one?
They're not accurate, right? They're not accurate in part because they exclude so many people, right? Which is part of what I was talking about, right? All the deaths in London, no, not even remotely, right? But we also, this is actually a really interesting thing that happens in the field of demography, where people are going back and trying to determine, because the plague bills are the first instance of a really robust data set. And we know that there were a lot of people who died, but people want to know how accurate it is, and we have no way of knowing. right? There's no way of sort of reverse engineering. We can point to all of the ways in which we know there must have been exclusions, right, because of how they were prioritized, but we don't know how accurate they were. And there's a lot of anxiety in the moment, right? In the parish clerk's charter, they're threatened with death if they aren't careful about their accuracy. There are epistolary accounts of various parish clerks being worried about the female searchers and how they must not be as accurate as one would wish them to be, and yet they still have to use them. So this problem of inaccuracy is sort of everywhere through this. And part of what I'm interested in is the ways in which the tabular form doesn't tell you anything about that inaccuracy, right? It's just completely filled out. And in Grant's tables, which are these life tables that are sort of the beginning of statistics, demography, and life insurance industry, he says it's complete, but there are whole years that are completely left out, right? And there's no explanation for why. The plague hits during the years that he leaves out. Another thing that's not at all in these are martial deaths, right? The British Civil War, 1660s, right, is a huge spasm, and there are no conflict deaths anywhere in this, right? So it's definitely not an accurate picture of mortality in the early modern period, and it's not accurate ever since, right? There are reams and reams written about Iraq war body count and how that's more accurate than state counts because they're not interested in counting civilians, but also deeply problematic.
So when you hear people talking about the plague and all, is that just an estimation?
Mm-hmm.
When you hear about,
yeah, when people talk about the numbers.
Statistics.
Yeah. They're estimates built on, right, the first practices of regular accounting. So they're better than before, but they're imprecise.
So are you saying that they were only reporting male deaths? I wasn't sure if I quite... I noticed that one of the deaths was teeth.
Yeah, you can die by teeth, by wind, by rising of the lights. You can die by all kinds of things.
I'm looking at some historical documents trying to make sense of what the hell that means. And I know that, yeah, sometimes children died of something to do with teeth. Like there's probably some kind of infection, but I'm not really clear. But that just means... So it must not have been just adult men that they were recording, right? If it's teeth, or is it?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like any children and any female humans, just not there.
They are there, but they're there as unusual instances. They're not systematically counted, right? The systematic counts are of free men. Free men have to be over the age of 21. You do see, right, recording of deaths of women in childbirth, right? You see recording of stillbirths. And you see most often it's suicides where women show up. But you can't trust, right, that these are adults by any stretch of the imagination. They do have a male-female count, right? And the christenings are certainly of children, right? So like there's this funny messiness in the practices that go from being church rolls, right, where they want to capture the christenings and the burials into this state document that really cares about the free men. And so you have a kind of hybridity for a fair amount of time where you can see some women and some children, but they're not systematically counted in the way that males over the age of 21 who are part of the Anglican Church are. Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Okay, so this is Napoleon's position, was the one who invented this concept of basically, in your research, did you find that he's like, hey, maybe I should check this out?
So he's the first one to give it to someone to wear as surveillance. But this is the weighted lever that I was talking about, right? And it's an innovation that was made by a watchmaker. So you get the innovation of the weighted lever that can track the steps and also wind the watch. But it's Napoleon's doctor who says, hold on, I can trick Napoleon into thinking that he's just winding his watch, but instead I can make sure that he's out doing the work that the exercise that he's supposed to be doing. And there are others. So Spencer and Perkins are creating watches at roughly the same time, and they have these amazing advertisements where it's like a gentleman, right? And he's in his awesome outfit, and in the advertisement it's talking about how a gentleman might want to go out and survey his land, but it could also be used for those who are ill and confined to home but need to move, which is a really interesting thing, right? Like you have to have a really big house in order to have a step counter while you're confined at home sick. So it's clear that they're like highly elite objects. Yeah.
I had a question about something that you were talking about before the talk and you briefly mentioned during your talk, which is this is not your dissertation.
Nope.
I'm a grad student in the dissertation phase.
Yep.
And so I'm interested in the fact that you wrote another book after writing that and got that published. And specifically because beforehand I heard you, like I wasn't,
it's fine.
Conversation, but like I heard you say something about like it's because where you ended up had different ideals about something or another.
That's right.
And so I was just interested to hear, especially like we're a pretty DH happy campus, but you know, Lord knows where I'll end up. So I was wondering, how do you navigate the changing nature of DH? Obviously, you ended up somewhere great now, but like, has it always been like that?
No. I mean, right, so I received my PhD in 2009. I was an English PhD at Brown, right, and specializing in the Renaissance, and I couldn't do this as my dissertation, right? Like it just wasn't possible. And so my dissertation was on the relationship between poetry and mathematics, because I've had this obsession for a long time. And I wanted to do something, but it needed to be more legible as literary, right? And my advisors were right. Write the thing that will make you legible on the market. And while we might, point to the rise in digital humanities and transdisciplinary studies as like awesome, the truth is jobs exist in disciplines, right? That is largely the case. And so, my dissertation was, despite spanning history of science and literature, it was still relatively traditional, right? My DH work was always parallel. When I was at Brown, the Women Writers Project is now at Northeastern, but when I was at Brown, it was there, and I was told that I was throwing away my career by working there, right? That obviously hasn't borne out, but that was the advice from my department, right? From my DGS, from people on my committee, right? It was just a bad idea. So I just kept it parallel, right? I was like, oh, it's fine, it's parallel, we'll keep going along. I got a job at Harvey Mudd as a fellow, and then at Scripps as a faculty member, in part because my partner and I were moving together, right? And I was in a traditional English department where there were 6 of us, and 3 of them had started that job before I was born, right? Before I was born. Those were my 3 senior colleagues, right? They didn't want to hear any of this, right? And so I had, a relationship with the Pennsylvania Press, and was going to publish my dissertation as a book on imagining possibility in poetry and mathematics. Still pretty unusual, but much more traditional than this one is, right? When I was recruited away from Scripps to Arizona State University, that institution from top to bottom has a very different theory of things, for better and for worse, right? And so I was given free rein to do whatever I want. I was also told, my husband at the time was already tenured. I was coming up for tenure the year that I left, and I was told that I had to start my clock over, right? Which is why I was 9 years at assistant. And I said, great, if I'm gonna start my clock over, then I'm gonna write the book I wanna write, right? Because I had time. I was like, here's the time, great, I'm gonna do it. And that's what this book is, right? It's the dissertation I couldn't write. It's the thing that I had always wanted to go back to. It's always been the passion project, right? And that's awesome. I was like, woohoo, do that, write it. And I loved it, and I love talking about it, right? But you'll also note that this is a traditional book, right? Like that's a book. It's not a digital project. And even, at Scripps, that Mellon grant that I got, it was $1.5 million, right? That's a sizable grant for a humanist. I was told by the leadership that wouldn't count for research, it wouldn't count for teaching, and it wouldn't count for service. It literally counted for nothing, right? And I had a colleague who said, I don't know what it is that you do, but when I die, I don't want my English department to look like what you do, right? So So I have had parallel for a very long time, and it is only now, right, with my job at Dartmouth and a little bit at ASU, but really now at Dartmouth, that my two scholarly selves can exist as one. And it's awesome. It's amazing. It feels fantastic. I'm super excited. But I'm also deeply mindful of both that like past history, but also the fact that the situation that I'm in is incredibly unusual, right? So write something that's legible, right? Do a project that people can understand, and recognize that the people who are evaluating you when it comes to jobs are people who might have had their job since before you were born. And right, they may have much more conventional senses of what counts as scholarship. And you just have to be strategic. And I don't want to say, you know, Matt Kirschenbaum was the person who said to me, Jackie, you have to do twice the work. And I was like, fuck. And he's like, until, you know, those of us who are doing DH work get up into the sort of administrative level, you're going to have to. That is unfortunately still true. I wish it weren't, but it is. Yeah, yeah.
May I just interject? For questions precisely like these ones, which are crucially important, we'll also be available to talk to Jackie this afternoon from 4 to 5 in Oak Hall 236. So these are very important questions. Thank you for asking that.
I have a little bit of a piggyback to that one, which goes back to my very first question about life versus death, and your choice to pick death to focus on in like the first half of your book. Was that a choice out of marketability, or was it because that actually was your passion and you figured that this is what you wanted to write about?
Oh, I cared more about the dead people than the living people. But I did. I do still, right? Like if you ask me, do you want to worry about counting dead people or counting living people, I'll pick counting dead people all the time. That said, part of what happened in that trajectory was that I had opportunities to talk about the quantification of human life that weren't necessarily my research, right? Like invitations to write for Slate, or discuss, you know, opportunities to go and talk to people about, you know, feminist approaches to quantification, et cetera. And so I had kind of had this like smattering of things that had developed alongside. And when I sat down to write the book, I was like, because I've been sitting with this for 5, 6, 7 years, right? I began to see that I couldn't separate the necropolitics from the biopolitics, that there was an interesting intervention to be made that brought those two things together. I really do, I didn't know that I was going to find historical evidence, right, of, you know, 1525, roughly the same contemporary moment. But the more I've looked in the archives, et cetera, the more I see a really tight imbrication, actually. And it manifests differently in the US, in other British and European colonies, in the UK, in Europe, right? It has different inflections, and those are interesting to me. So I like them both, but my heart is in counting dead people.
And so since that's your answer, can I piggyback on my piggyback?
Sure.
My question would be if you also look at grievability, like for example Judith Butler does, and grievability of lives, whose lives are grievable, and
So certainly I'm familiar with her work. I think it's super interesting. You know, I think in the process of writing this book, there was a lot of stuff about how we count death in a more contemporary moment that I wasn't able to do simply for the reasons of time and space and what actually makes a functional book. And that'll probably be the seed of a second book project, thinking about how it is that we count our dead, why we count them, what does that construct, et cetera. I'm really interested. You know, the case of military deaths is really interesting to me. It's also just a little too close. I have many family members in the military, and so it's a project that I feel like I need a good whole heart in order to do. And I've done some stuff on like the Syrian refugee crisis and why those numbers don't seem to register. And I find it so painful that sometimes I have to step away from it. But I will continue to think about that for sure.
One last question. All right, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.